So Matt Gaetz has put out this incredibly racist ad claiming that the coronavirus originated from a laboratory in Wuhan.
Dishonest and negligent allegations have now ended EcoHealth's carefully reviewed research designed to stop pandemics. His funding from the NIH, the U.S. National Institutes of Health, was killed 2 weeks ago by a political disinformation campaign.
Now, we've all heard this conspiracy theory before, but now Matt Gaetz is saying that this conspiracy theory has been somehow verified.
The NIH gives this $3.7 million grant to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. They then advertise that they need coronavirus researchers. Following that, coronavirus erupts in Wuhan.
I do want to point out the claim that's being made, though, by Matt Gaetz, which is pretty hilarious. Matt Gaetz is saying that he is vindicated because the National Institute of Health, a United States government agency, offered up grants for gain-of-function research with coronaviruses. For those of you that don't know, gain-of-function research happens from time to time when you're looking at infectious diseases that you are concerned that simple mutations might lead to major problems, or a jump from one species to another, particularly a jump to humans from other species. Now, this type of research is mildly controversial, and there are arguments for and against it. When it comes to something like coronavirus, though, the relative risk is usually seen as relatively low because coronaviruses are RNA viruses that have an incredibly high rate of recombination, so any recombination between strains is seen as something that's relatively likely. And so testing out potential recombinations is very much on the board because you are trying to jump ahead of what would be natural trends. You do that so that you can rapidly develop vaccines like we did. The research that went into developing the vaccines that eventually did come out has been going on for longer than 10 years. And that has happened because of the research into coronavirus.
Of course, the Wuhan coronavirus that sprung out of Wuhan, China, came out of the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Even if there was community spread within Wuhan before we thought, that would not absolve the Wuhan Institute of Virology of the lack of safety standards and the high probability that that is precisely where this pandemic was launched onto the world.
Now we also need to explain something. Let's get the basics straight. So, what happens is you have scientists and researchers go around the world collecting samples from bats to test for coronaviruses that exist, and then you work on developing vaccines for potential strains that could affect humans. That is how this research is done. The value of gain-of-function research in that regard is to basically test out recombinations that are likely so that you can develop vaccines and be prepared for the potential outcomes. But what Matt Gaetz is saying is that the funding from the United States is proving that China is responsible. This is the most ridiculous claim on its face. So what Matt Gaetz is taking as a victory lap is on its face ridiculous. But we also need to acknowledge that the scientific community largely rejects the hypothesis that it originated from the lab in the first place. Most scientists agree that COVID-19 is a strain of coronavirus that came about through natural causes. Because, to be clear, once again, coronaviruses have an incredibly high rate of recombination. An article that was published in September, so very recently, September 25th, very recent article that was published on Nature.com, and Nature, in case you're wondering, is a very reputable scientific journal that has a news page, and on their news page they released this information talking about a close relative of COVID-19 being found naturally in Laos. In the article is a quote from a virologist that said, and I quote, "I am more convinced than ever that SARS-CoV-2 has a natural origin." All of the new evidence that is coming out is suggesting that COVID-19 most definitely came from natural origins.
There is a huge amount of evidence that these viruses repeatedly emerge into people through things like eating wildlife.
Jamie Metzel, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and former NSC staffer under President Clinton.
So certainly the animal market, the Wuhan wet market, I think most people have ruled that out, and it was clear last January that that was essentially a lie.
And can we talk about how racist this ad is too? I mean, what's with that background music? And seriously, trying to paint China as responsible for something that you admit was research that was funded by the United States and say that that somehow was the origin of coronavirus despite not having any evidence? And let's be clear, a report that came out from the Department of National Intelligence came out very clearly saying that it was most likely natural causes that led to COVID-19 coming into existence. And they said that only 2 agencies out there had any suspicion that it could have been some sort of biological weapon that was created in a lab. But even then, they were very uncertain about that. In fact, the Department of National Intelligence came out and very clearly said, and I quote, "We judge the virus was not developed as a biological weapon." So what we have here is two government agencies, according to the DNI, that couldn't rule out a lab leak theory. And then you have a general scientific community that very much is pushing against this narrative, saying no, it almost certainly came through natural causes. But you have Republicans taking this victory lap for whatever reason. It's absolutely ridiculous. And it's all part of this Cold War escalation with China. I mean, that's the reason why the lab leak theory is recirculating anyway, is because there's some people in the government that think that it would be useful to have as propaganda against China. And reactionaries don't want people looking too much into the fact that the United States has been funding gain-of-function research for a very long time. And even on the slim chance that Matt Gaetz is correct that it was a lab leak of a gain-of-function research, it was funded by the United States. It's so ridiculous. There were Americans that were working in that lab in China. It's ridiculous to think that that was the hotbed of developing biological weapons to bring down the West. No, it wasn't biological weapons that were bringing down the West. It was America's own fault. Our disastrous response to coronavirus. This is all just the Republicans trying to cover up for America's disastrous response to the coronavirus. The United States basically did nothing to protect the people from coronavirus, basically did nothing to help people during the pandemic, gave people a little over $2,000 in stimulus checks, and then called it a day. Meanwhile, other countries like China, Vietnam, and Cuba shut down their economies, provided food and other necessities to their people, and then even went so far as in China to build extra hospitals. This is a normal response to a pandemic, where you shut things down for a little bit, keep everybody indoors, do contact tracing, and make sure that you stop the virus from spreading. The United States basically didn't do any of those things in the way that it needed to be done, and we are dealing with the consequences today. But instead of admitting fault and admitting the failures of our capitalist system, Matt Gaetz is trying to make it some sort of conspiracy theory about China. This is Ben Carollo with Rebel Headquarters. You can catch my show Galaxy Brain every Friday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time on the Young Turks Twitch channel. You can also follow me on Twitter if you want to stay up to date with my content.